Hello and welcome back to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we rank every politician and tell you how well or how badly they're doing this week. This week, I'm joined by Rory Taylor.
Hello.
Zach Michaelis.
Hello.
And Ben Blissett.
Hello.
How are we doing?
Good.
Oh,
Great.
yeah, very good.
Yeah, excited.
It's been quite the week.
Yeah, it has actually, hasn't it?
There's been lots of news this week, I feel, which
Yeah,
is, for a news channel, that's good news.
Yeah, for the rest of the world. Maybe not.
We'll see how it goes in the World Leader Leaderboard. But as always, let's start with the people who we think are doing best this week, our winners of the week. So, Rory, let's start with you and your winner of the week.
Yeah, my winner of the week is Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is despite me making him my loser of the week a few weeks ago. I think what's happened in the first few weeks of Trump's term is that he's demonstrated that he is going to be a very pro-Israel president.
Yeah.
I moved him down a couple of weeks ago because he was strong-armed into accepting a ceasefire deal. But everything that Trump has done since then has sort of signaled that Netanyahu is going to get a pretty good sort of set of actions out of Trump. So this is just a short list of what he's done. He pretty immediately lifted sanctions on Israeli settlers in the West Bank, reversing something that Biden imposed. He's also reversed Biden's suspension of the 2,000-pound bomb that they sent to Israel. So he started exporting those to Israel again.
Yeah.
And perhaps most sort of visibly a win for Netanyahu is that he probably, as people are watching this, he is in Washington, D.C., and he is the first foreign leader to visit Trump since Trump has returned to office. Yeah. So that's a big sort of diplomatic signal to Netanyahu that Trump is going to be sort of backing him. Especially when you compare this to what happened under Biden. You had a lot of the arguments against Netanyahu within Israel was that Netanyahu was sacrificing the US-Israel relationship, and people like Benny Gantz were saying Netanyahu can't handle this. I'm much more favoured in the US, so we've got to get rid of him. But now Netanyahu can point to this trip and say, look, they like me in the US. Yeah. I'm going to safeguard that relationship, and it looks like that's what Trump is going to do.
Netanyahu, winner of the week. What do we make of that?
Yeah, I do agree with Rory, especially because I think there was some ambiguity at the very start of Trump's term, or even before his inauguration, when he apparently pressured Netanyahu to sign that Gaza ceasefire deal, where he might fall on the sort of question of Israel and Palestine. I also think it's worth saying that he's also said nothing about Israel's expanded presence in the Golan Heights, which does now look to be like at least semi-permanent. Does that like Israel has essentially annexed that territory? Yeah. I think one caveat is Iran. There is also some, and we've talked about this in a video that's come out today, but there is some evidence that Trump is going to push for a deal with Iran, which is something the Israelis have always resisted. Yeah. They didn't like the JCPOA when Obama first signed it back in 2015. And I think if Trump does push for that, that might strain the US-Israel relationship. I think the best way of thinking about all these, by the way, is that he clearly just wants deals. He just wants to try and like close the book on certain issues, presumably so America can withdraw from the Middle East. Yeah. And I think what's happened in the Israel one is he's pushed for the ceasefire deal, and Netanyahu has gone fine, but as long as you give me everything else. Yeah. And that
looks like he's getting everything else.
Yeah, it looks like he's getting really quite a lot of it. But I think if he's pursuing a similar policy in Iran, that might put the relationship under strain, because the last thing the Israelis want is a deal, even if there are a whole lot of concessions. If the Iranians make a whole lot of concessions. But yeah, so
what do we think this signals more broadly for the region then? This is obviously positive news for Israel's objectives, or at least kind of Netanyahu's objectives. But as you say, there's impacts on the rest of the region, and how Israel interfaces with other countries is kind of very complicated in the region. So what do we think this means for other countries?
So another thing sort of from this part of the world that Trump has had a big impact on already is he's called for Palestinians to be effectively moved out of Gaza. I think in Trump's sort of description, it's so they can, clean up the Gaza Strip and I guess improve it. Yeah. And so Palestinians can move back and live there. But that's, a long-term goal of certain elements of Israeli politics is to sort of encourage or force Palestinians out of Gaza so it can be settled and sort of incorporated into Israel. So Trump's sort of floating this idea is a big win for those parts of Israeli society, and it's gone down very badly with Arab states, Egypt especially, which would be the place that would take those Palestinians. So there's a sign there that Trump is going to be on, not received too well by those Arab leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Final thing on Netanyahu, how is he doing domestically at this point? Do we know? Obviously, up and down. Is he also performing better domestically right now, or is he also struggling there?
I think the polling's actually been pretty stable in that his Likud would win a plurality. It's sort of like ticked up very slightly over the past few months. But I think it's an open question as to whether or not his current coalition, because it has been expanded, would still hold on to the majority if the election was held. I think Netanyahu is still quite unpopular. His sort of net approval ratings are definitely in the negatives.
Yeah.
But what I think is clearly true is that in getting these concessions out of Trump, he has avoided the pitfall that Benny Gantz suffered, which was when you get sort of portrayed as a American lackey by the sort of like the right of Israeli media.
Yeah.
And that proved electorally fatal for Gantz, and I think it would have done for Netanyahu if he hadn't got any of these sort of concessions out of.
Yes.
But I think very quickly on the how other countries respond, I think it's clearly terrible for Palestinians. I think not just the sort of suggestion that he could push Palestinians out of Gaza, but also his tacit endorsement of settlers in the West Bank. It really does look like the sort of far right of Israeli politics has got what it's wanted in that respect. You know, the US is now pushing for fundamentally a sort of one-state solution, but an Israeli one-state solution. And I think it's what really matters is how Arab countries respond. They've been sort of like conspicuously quiet throughout in the sort of year and a bit since October 7th, not particularly vocal in their support for Palestinians and in Gaza, in part because it sort of morphed into a Iranian proxy conflict as opposed to sort of question of Arab nationalism. But whether or not they sort of draw the line at, you know, pushing Palestinians out of Gaza, I think that's the open question. If that is the case, then I think Israel will be somewhat isolated in the Middle East. I don't see the Abraham Accords continuing. If, for instance, the Saudis say that's too much.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this relationship continues between Netanyahu and Trump, and also, as you say, how that plays domestically, whether those concessions help Netanyahu or kind of link him more to the US in an unhelpful way. Ben,
yes,
we're jumping down the line. We don't normally do this, but I'm going to move to you next. Who is your winner of the week?
Well, my winner of the week is Keir Starmer. I know, obviously, he's had a pretty difficult few months, to be fair, as Prime Minister. Basically, everything he's tried has either been received quite badly by the public, so whether that's inheritance tax on farmers, there's a few other instances as well, but he's not been doing terribly well as Prime Minister. And that only seemed to get worse when Trump was elected. I mean, the assumption would have been that Trump is maybe slightly hostile. He's one of his right-hand men, Elon Musk, obviously didn't take a shine to Starmer or UK politics generally. So it looked like he might sway Trump's opinion. But it actually looks like this week there might be some, reasons for optimism with the UK-US relationship. I know Zach obviously wrote a video about this, and that's coming out on the UK channel soon. But effectively, despite the fact that Trump is starting trade wars left, right, and centre with neighbouring countries, it seems like the UK might be exempt for a couple of reasons. One, which is that Trump actually seems fairly positive towards the UK, despite previous assumptions. I mean, he'd said of Starmer relatively recently that he thought he was doing a good job, but also because of the fact that there's this sort of weird, I mean, Zach, you might want to talk about this a little bit, which is this weird sort of difference in the way of difference between the UK and the US and their attitudes towards a trade surplus and deficit. So the US claims that they ran a surplus with the UK with trade in 2023 of about £15 billion. The UK, the Office for National Statistics, claims it's actually a deficit of £90 billion. So the discrepancy between the data here is that is the crown dependencies. So it's Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. So they have a lot of financial services there. So they import a lot from the US, which is where this discrepancy between the US and the UK data comes from. So this is relatively good news for the UK because it looks like the US is looking at this as sort of beneficial to them, which is why they're not. It's unlikely that Trump's going to start this trade war with the UK. It's also just, as I sort of mentioned at the start here, the opposite of what we would have expected when Trump was elected. There was a lot, and I mean, we made videos on this about why this is just bad news for Starmer, who's already had a really bad start as Prime Minister. But the fortunes seem to be changing slightly, and it seems that Elon Musk, at least his sort of attitude towards the UK, doesn't seem to be resonating with Trump as much as we previously assumed, which is very good news for Starmer.
What do we make of Starmer winning this week? Another one where Trump's attitudes dictate who wins and loses. But
he really is the world's most influential man.
Wow.
Whoa. Give me a minute.
Oh, no.
Rory and Zach, before we move on to that segue, Starmer being winner of the week.
As I agree. Yeah, it's definitely a win for Starmer. I think more broadly, I find it kind of depressing that the UK can like squeeze out a win from this, because in my mind the moral thing to do would be to sort of join forces with Canada and the EU in sort of fighting back against what Trump is doing. But sort of sneaking around and getting a win out
Using
of
our
it
crown
is
dependencies.
pretty cheeky. I think for the last few years the UK has sort of managed to avoid having to choose between the US and EU. So going forwards, I think that is going to be tricky for Starmer, because I think that decision is going to come quite rapidly. And siding with the US may be good for the kind of trade war thing, but I don't think that will go down particularly well with British people or people, the leaders in Europe who we're trying to have slightly closer relations with.
I just put a third poll in that. I think it's China as well. So it's balancing your relation between the US and the EU. So far, I think there might be, you might be able to sort of have your cake and eat it here. If Trump starts a trade war with the EU and not the UK, that does, the sort of global macroeconomic consequences will drag on the UK. But in relative terms, we'll lose a pretty good place. But I think the other poll is we have to pivot. We have to balance how close we are to China in relation to both the US and the EU, because, well, you would have thought that Trump would oppose the idea of the UK, one of America's longest standing allies, getting any closer to China, given that he at least, in the first term, was very concerned about the geopolitical competition between the US and China. But what is even more interesting about this is that actually we've made some pretty explicit overtures towards the Chinese recently. Rachel Reeves obviously there on a trip not too long ago during that bond market turmoil. And that doesn't seem to have irked Trump at all. And I think this all plays into the fact that actually it looks like in his second term, Trump is going to be a fair bit softer on China than maybe most commentators anticipated.
Do we think this is a trend we're going to see in future episodes, that Trump's whims end up dictating the board? Kind of meta commentary about the board.
Not just future
Do we think
episodes. This is the world. This is unfortunately...
But do you think, this is definitely, unsurprising. When we first started this, you were like the back end of Biden's presidency, so it didn't really matter. But can we expect every episode to be this ex-world leader? Trump said something nice about them this week.
I think maybe less so in the future, because I think the thing we just talked about in the Israel context is that he clearly wants to get some deals done so that he can actually focus on, well, I was going to say America domestically, but I don't think it is America domestically. So he can focus on essentially continental North America, because that is his priority at the moment, or that clearly is his ideological priority. And the same thing with these tariffs is, you can see them as a negotiating ploy, but I think fundamentally he wants to try and put in sufficient trade barriers to balance America's overall trade deficit. Whether or not this will actually happen ever, I think probably no, but for complicated reasons. But I think he's hoping that if he puts in a whole load of tariffs now, America's trade deficit will balance, and then he can focus on annexing Canada, Mexico, Panama, whatever. And so I think we're getting a very busy start to his presidency, but I think that in the future his sort of political attention will be turned inwards. Well, I sort of hope that it'd be quite a chaotic 4 years if it was like
I suppose at the moment we're also still kind of norm setting, that this win from Ben here is partially, it's not as bad for the UK as we thought it would be. So it's the first few weeks dictate the vague vibes, and then maybe after that it's we're no longer surprised by these things.
Yeah, definitely true.
Fingers crossed we're no longer surprised by things in a few weeks' time, but we'll see.
Doesn't feel likely.
Final winner of the week, Zach, who is it for you?
Well, slightly related to what we've just talked about, but it is going to be Xi Jinping. And I think Xi Jinping is having a great time at the moment, for at least three reasons. First and most obviously, the tariffs that Trump has imposed are far softer than the sort of 60% universal tariff he mentioned during the campaign. It's just 10% on China, which is less than Canada, even when you take into account the average tariff put on China before that. On top of that, I think Trump's Taiwan policy has been really fascinating so far. So he gave that sort of press conference where he had a go at Taiwan for stealing America's semiconductor business quite recently. That sort of follows on from similar comments during the campaign, and said that he would be imposing massive tariffs on them as well. He's then also frozen aid to Taiwan. He's just hired a guy called something Beatty, I think Scott Beatty or Doug Beatty, as one of the White House sort of foreign policy officials, who has made it very, very clear that he basically wants to give Taiwan back to China. So it really does look like Trump is sort of just going to give up on Taiwan. And not only is that a bit of a shock, everyone thought he'd be pretty strong on China and Taiwan generally, But it's also a massive reversal from Biden's policy.
Yeah.
Biden was the most hawkish American president on Taiwan that there's ever been. He said on multiple occasions the US will defend Taiwan, a violation of that long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity. And I think Xi Jinping, I imagine he just can't believe his luck. And finally, I think Trump's both his sort of trade wars and his sort of neo-imperial ambitions are massive soft power wins for China in that sort of constant ongoing soft power competition between the two superpowers.
What do we make of this? Xi Jinping moving up the board.
Yeah, I think just to sort of piggyback off something Zach said, the sort of soft power thing, I think China will also be looking at the Trump's suspension of foreign aid worldwide, and well, not just the suspension, what looks like possibly the complete closure of the US aid program, which is tens of billions of dollars that go to just everything you can think of around the world.
Yeah.
And it's this bizarre thing where it's viewed by the sort of Elon Musk types as like a waste of money that does absolutely nothing for America, when it's actually a key part of the US's sort of global influence.
Yeah.
As well as just being a lifeline to a huge number of people.
Yeah.
And I think the US sort of dropping that opens up this massive vacuum that other countries like China can aim to fill. And
that China's already proved so adept at doing. I mean, China has enjoyed some massive soft power wins off what you might call its economic diplomacy, and some hard power wins. I mean, that famous, there's a sort of myth about Chinese debt trap diplomacy, that the idea they sort of deliberately overburden certain countries with debt and then take strategic concessions, which is shown to be a bit of a myth. But occasionally it does happen. There's a port in Sri Lanka, which is the sort of classic example. So I think that's great. The last tiny thing I'll say is that one of the, I think, underremarked points is that the tariffs on Mexico also benefit China in lots of ways, because Mexico has emerged as sort of the like post-tariff industrial competitor to China, supplying the American market, and crippling the Mexican industrial base in that sense takes away a competitor from China.
Absolutely.
He's
winning across the board.
Honestly, I think it's hard to sort of overstate how good the first few weeks would have been for Xi Jinping. And then finally, Trump, I think, was quite conspicuous in his Davos address that he appealed to Xi Jinping to help him sort out the deal in Ukraine, which is, again, a massive sort of like change of tone, especially, again, compared to Biden. So I think that there are lots of reasons that Xi Jinping will be feeling pretty good.
Interesting. All three people that we've mentioned so far, Netanyahu, Starmer, and Xi Jinping, are all featured in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, which this time runs through the 25 most influential people in the entire world as ranked by yourselves and by us. We have compiled a list of the 25 most influential people in the entire world, and we're going to be writing about each of them, about each of their power, the stories behind their power, what they do with their power, all kinds of interesting things about each of these 25 people. And as I say, it features all of the people we've discussed so far, and actually all of our losers of the week are also featured. I'm not going to tell you where, because that's part of the fun. Where are they ranked? Who's number one? Well, number one is Trump, because he's on the front page, as you can see from this preview image of the front page, which might be the first time we've shared it. There it is. Trump is number one, but 2 through 25 are yet to be revealed. But these other 5 people are all on the list. And if you want to read more about who the most influential people in the world are, why they matter, what they're doing with their power, then you should pick up a copy of our magazine, Too Long. And you can do that by going to the link in the description, and by using the code 2podcast, you'll get £2 off any order, which means you can get a copy for like less than a tenner, which is crazy. Especially if you subscribe. It's so cheap. It's like £7. And by doing so, you support our journalism, you support this podcast, and you allow us to keep doing important things.
Really important things.
Speaking about what the audience can do, let's move on to the audience suggestion. Okay, so every week we allow the audience to select one person who is either added to the board or moved on the board by judging it based on the comment section. This week's person who we're adding to the board is Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservative Party. As always, we'll run down the line. We'll see whether you think she is a winner or a loser, and then we'll decide where she moves. So, Rory, I'll start with you at that end. Is Kemi a winner or a loser this week?
I think she's a loser this week. Are we expanding
for
on
it.
it? I imagine Ben is more clued up on UK politics. He'll probably have more to say on this, but I think just Nigel Farage and Reform's continued dominance is probably too strong a word, but over the Conservatives at the moment is enough reason for her to be a loser.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the polling, not that it was ever good, but it's looked worse the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, looking really bad for her. I mean, she's had, ever since she's become leader, a really tough job and has been doing that job, to be fair, quite badly, even considering.
Yeah.
But last week was the first week that all the major pollsters had a poll showing Reform ahead of the Tories. So every major pollster had Reform ahead, which is remarkable. I mean, we had the odd poll come through that suggested that Reform were ahead, but to have all of them is I mean, quite big. And also there's been a couple of there's been a couple of pollsters that were looking at seat share as well, and one by the Observer put Reform on 76 seats.
Wow.
Which is obviously getting close to the 1-2-1 that the Conservatives won in the election last year. Electoral Maps also did one that put them on 114, but theirs is a little less scientific, so it's probably not best to look into them. But either
Even
way,
still,
either way,
more
it's
than
still
5.
an indication, and it's more than 5. I mean, exactly, it shows just how well Reform are doing, and it is sort of.
Although, don't they mostly take Labour seats?
Yeah, I was going to say.
In a lot of these, they do take Labour, but the Conservatives aren't making headroom, so it means that Reform are gaining seats and are gaining on the Conservatives.
Reform are also closing on like national level polling. Like they've obviously overtaken the Tories, but Tories, Labour, and Reform are all pretty close.
Yeah, which is. And this is the thing, is that I think the Conservatives were hoping that in electing Badenoch, who was considered to be a right winger, that then her dragging the Conservative Party right would sort of stop Reform having their sort of USP with the electorate, and that's just not been the case. Badenoch has not announced any policy. She hasn't really taken the fight to Reform yet, and we're seeing that reflected in polls, and it's getting worse for her.
I'm interested whether we think that ever works as a strategy, because I feel like it's something we hear quite a lot across Europe with various kind of like further right parties, how you want to label them exactly, but Reform type parties, and then the more centre right party thinks, oh, we'll go more right and we can squeeze them out. Does that ever work? I feel like in our videos, at least, it seems to quite often fail.
I think so. I think that is a very common meme in like sort of like progressive discourse. That not, it's not a diss, but like there's this sort of idea that right wing parties, they shouldn't tack to the right. It never works. I think what's the counterfactual, right?
Sure.
Like if the Tories had stuck with sort of Cameron-esque austerity and sort of like nice fluffy social policies, you can plausibly imagine them doing even worse.
Sure.
I don't know if that is true. The other thing is that I don't think the data is that conclusive. In a way, so for instance, I think it is probably true that the Christian Democrats, by tacking to the right in Germany, have actually stamped out the AfD to some extent. I think also there are sort of counter cases in places like Denmark, where it's not a perfect analogy, but I often sort of talk about these people as the Social Democrats, who are sort of traditionally centre-left, pivoted very, very hard to the right on cultural issues, especially immigration, way back in sort of 2019. And that really worked for them. And they sort of prevented the Sweden Democrats. No, not Sweden, of course, that's Denmark. But they presented the sort of like, there's the Danish far-right party from ever doing that well. And there are other cases in places like Spain, I think, where Vox have not actually done that well and been squeezed out by the People's Party, sort of rightwards tack. So yeah, I don't know. I think that you probably can't draw a general lesson.
Okay.
To my mind, I think the main thing, right, is it's just actually a lot of it just comes down to having how competently you can pull off right-wing politics.
Yeah.
I don't think the issue is necessarily Badenoch's politics. I think they've actually very little political space on, especially on the sort of like salient cultural issues between her and Farage. It's just that Farage is a better politician than she is. And I think if you had someone like, again, Boris Johnson is a good example. I mean, you couldn't explain Boris Johnson's electoral success just by talking about his politics, his policies. Maybe you could a little bit, but it's actually just how good a political operator he is.
Just on that as well, and specifically on, I know you're saying that it might not be the best idea to look at policy specifically, but I think there is at least something in that. And I think there was some expectation that even just in terms of her discourse, she'd move further right. And she's opted not to. And maybe moving right is not the best idea in tackling Reform, but what's an even worse idea is doing nothing.
Sure.
And that's what she's currently doing. And it's just giving Reform more like media time, more opportunity to sort of take the mantle as the representatives of the right in the UK, which is exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
Whenever there's an opposition to Starmer, it's always Reform leading that charge at the minute on every policy issue, and it's just they're in another downward spiral. The Conservatives. It's I can't see it getting better unless she really sort of steps up her media performance.
So one last thing. The
Go
last
on. Last
thing I'll say is that I think that just thinking about it, I think you have to. It's too much. I think is that the issue. Establishment politicians are very sort of like poll-led, and they'll just sort of like follow whatever dominant policy issue is the talk of the town. And what happens is Reform set the agenda. They'll talk about immigration a lot, and the Tories, instead of being like, no, we want to talk about, I don't know, debt, whatever, something where they might have an advantage, they just sort of follow Reform into that territory, and then they end up fighting on ground that they don't want to be fighting. They want to be fighting on issues that they're strong on. And I think quite a lot of it for traditional centre-right politicians is about being able to shift the discourse to a topic that you're more familiar with and that's perhaps less inflammatory. In some sense, I think, by the way, Friedrich Merz has done that quite well. He doesn't get enough attention, but he has actually come up with some pretty, not radical's too strong, but like pretty radical and different economic ideas that I think have been sort of well received by parts of the German centre.
We'll have to wait and see whether Kemi can replicate that in the UK quicker than Reform can close the gap and overtake the Labour Party as well. Thank you for your suggestion. Kemi has been placed in the losers section, just under the bottom half. And make sure to suggest who you want us to add or move next week and vote in the comments. Upvote the people you like, downvote the people you don't, and whoever lands at the top by recording next week, within reason, we will add or move on the board. So get your votes in and get commenting. Next, though, let's move to our losers of the week. Rory, let's start with you again. Who is your loser of the week?
So, fortunately, this is someone completely unrelated to Donald Trump.
Ah.
My loser of the week is Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. I have two main reasons for this. The first is that in the last week, an Italian court, for the third time in the last year, I think, has struck down her offshore asylum processing scheme that is set up in Albania. So for the third time, the people that Italy is, the asylum seekers that Italy has shipped to Albania have been shipped straight back. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that Meloni herself is now under investigation by prosecutors in Rome for a whole thing that happened, I think, last week, where Italy arrested a Libyan police chief, sometimes described as a warlord as well, based on an ICC warrant covering all sorts of like horrendous crimes, everything you can think of, basically. But the Italian government refused to validate that warrant and deported him back to Libya. So he escaped arrest and trial at the ICC. Meloni, so she's now under investigation for that. I think it's aiding and abetting a crime of some kind is what she's under investigation for. So that's bad enough that she's under that investigation. But I think it also highlights the weakness of the Italian government and European governments in general when it comes to their migration plans. So Italy relies a lot on the government or authorities in Libya to crack down on boat crossings across the Mediterranean. It's effectively a way for the Italian government to avoid having to do the awkward and nasty work of pushing people back at sea and allow more unpleasant people further south to do that for them. But it shows that they are subject to sort of, you could call it blackmail or just influence of these parties when it comes to migration issues. And I think that's a pretty bad look for Meloni.
It's pretty rough. Meloni moving down this week. What do we think, Zach?
Yeah, I think that conversation about immigration policy is interesting. I think that the real question is, I mean, I don't disagree with anything Rory's just said, but how do you fix it?
Yeah.
Is there a fix, especially if offshoring plans are illegal under sort of international law as it's currently interpreted, especially the ECHR, which is something that got in the way of the UK when we were trying to do our Rwanda plan. And I do think that, I mean, Rory's very right, that those schemes where you basically get sort of like North African countries and countries just south of the EU, like Turkey as well, to take responsibility for controlling European migrant flows, they sort of they do lend themselves to that dependence. Macron once called it a geopolitics of cynicism, which I think is a good turn of phrase. But I think they were sort of the only way of dealing with it, given that you don't have the capacity or necessarily the legal power to deport a significant number of people. I think that I imagine what will actually happen is that in the coming years, the European countries will make moves to make deporting and sort of processing people offshore more easy, more doable in legal terms. But for now, a lot of European countries are stuck in a bit of bind there. Although I don't think necessarily a bad look for her politically, because obviously it lends itself to that framing of me, Maloney, trying to fix this problem that we all agree on, but the courts, the bloody,
bloody courts,
the bloody judges get in the way.
Oh.
But yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, yet another example of countries attempting this in Europe, coming up across against issues. And as you say, it'll be interesting whether they do make actual changes to make it easier, because
it's worth saying
certainly there's appetite across Europe for doing this.
And Merz has talked up a similar plan and has flirted with actually using the facilities that the UK built in Rwanda. So there's definitely appetite.
Look
for
at us subsidising Germany.
I know. Well done.
I think so. Maloney's Albania scheme, the 3 times that it's been struck down has been by Italian courts, but the EC, the European Court, is actually ruling on it. That scheme specifically later this month, I think, and it is quite different from the Rwanda plan in a number of ways. Probably more legal than the Rwanda plan would be. So I think that will be a key moment to see whether this type of thing can go ahead once we get that ruling.
I think the main difference is that actually if your asylum claim is accepted in Albania, you can come back to Italy, whereas in the Rwanda plan, you were supposed to stay in Rwanda right away, basically.
Yeah. Rwanda was the best case scenario.
Yeah, Rwanda, that's why the whole safe country issue it was just so important.
Interesting. Well, let's see what happens, and let's see how Maloney keeps doing in the future. Next up, Ben, who is your loser of the week?
So my loser of the week is Volodymyr Zelensky. So he's been, I mean, this sort of goes back to the point of everybody being dictated by Trump here, but he's been excluded from talks with the US and Russia, or at least not included in talks with Russia and the US over how to end the war in Ukraine. Obviously, Zelensky's been quite frustrated by this and claimed it'd be very dangerous to conclude the war without his sort of inclusion in the conversation. And he has claimed that him and his team have been in contact with the Trump administration, but only sort of at a general level. And this is particularly bad for Zelensky at the moment because Russia's continuing to make slow but steady gains on the battlefield in Ukraine, and Ukraine are facing a shortage of manpower. And what that implies is if there is a deal to be struck with Russia, if there is a way to end the war and Russia are sort of on the attack, the deal might be ever so slightly more favourable to them than otherwise. So this is a particularly bad moment for Zelensky, and obviously just demonstrates what a lot of people already assume to be true, which is that upon Trump coming into office, that the US would be sort of providing less support to Ukraine than under Biden previously.
Yeah, interesting too that we obviously discussed, and I think even moved Zelensky up at the beginning of the year, around the fact that Trump actually seemed to be doing pretty good things for Ukraine, and maybe he was better than we thought. So interesting that's maybe swinging back again.
I think it follows a quite similar pattern to the Israel thing, right? I think that Trump's priority is getting a deal, not necessarily maintaining an alliance with any particular player. I actually think it's worth saying that Trump is apparently holding a bilateral with Moscow. I'm not sure it's actually Putin, but Moscow. But he has also held bilaterals with Kiev. So I think his strategy at the moment is, given that Ukraine and Russia are not ready to sit down in the same room as each other, he's doing his bilaterals first and seeing if he can sort of work out middle ground, which is obviously suboptimal from Zelensky's perspective, but I don't think it's necessarily surprising. I think that was always going to be the tactic. I'd also say that I don't think it's necessarily true that he is being less pro-Ukraine than we thought. I think so far it does look like he's being slightly more pro-Ukraine than maybe you would have worried during the campaign. We've talked about this in other podcasts, but the fact that he hasn't basically capitulated to Putin and has had a go at Putin at various forums, including most recently Davos. But the I think Ben is really, really right about is the battlefield. I think we sort of don't pay attention to it anymore. But the next big battle is for Pokrovsk, which is this sort of like a logistics hub. And it really is, logistics hub is a word that's like thrown around. People are talking about this strategically important town. It's just like a little village with a couple of like roads coming out of it. But this is like a massive sort of like rail and road center point for Ukraine's entire effort in the east. And the Russians have just made some progress to the south of Pokrovsk. which would probably precede a sort of like Bakhmut style encircling, and then a very, very long, horrible, sluggish battle. And I think it's probably fair to say if Pokrovsk falls, then almost the entire Ukrainian effort in the east is really at risk. And I think actually this is one of the reasons why I think we probably shouldn't expect peace talks to come to fruition anytime soon. I think that if Putin is looking at a map, he will be thinking, I want to get Pokrovsk first, and then we can do it. Well, conversely, I think it's one of the reasons that the Ukrainians, and there have been some other reports recently about the Ukrainians, Kellogg, I can't remember what his first name is, but he's basically Trump's Ukraine envoy, let slip. And the way that these negotiations are handled is wild, because they just sort of do say stuff on the fly, which is clearly supposed to be confidential. But he said Zelensky is happy to make soften his position on territory or land. And that's the sort of thing that Putin would love to hear, because it just confirms what is presumably the sense in the Kremlin that we're nearing Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian effort in the east is looking a bit precarious, and now Zelensky's clearly anxious because he's giving up land or talking about it to the Americans. So yeah, that's why I think we shouldn't expect peace talks anytime soon.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good video.
It could be.
Not done a battlefield video in a while.
No, that's true. I think we've got to wait until it actually sort of happens. But yeah.
Okay, let's move to our final loser of the week, which is your one, Zach. Who is your loser of the week?
Shock. It is Trump.
Whoa.
Yeah,
He's already dictated the whole board. How can he be a loser?
Very quickly, I think this week hasn't been good for him, because I think so far the sort of trade wars on especially Mexico and Canada haven't necessarily worked in the way I think he might have thought that they would. I think he delayed implementing the tariffs from Saturday until Tuesday, because I think he was hoping that basically Trump, Mexico and Canada would give him whatever it is that he wanted. I'm still not entirely sure. I mean, he wants to annex Canada, obviously, and there's something about fentanyl before Tuesday, so hopefully Monday. But so far, we're halfway through Monday. That hasn't happened. It looks very unlikely to happen.
Canada's not given itself up yet.
Nope, Trudeau has not accepted his position as governor of the 51st state. The other thing is that the dollar is up. That will not help Trump's attempts to balance the sort of American trade deficit. And oil is also up as sort of investors stress about turbulence to oil markets induced by tariffs. Trump has always worried about oil prices, and he's right to. Something that Trump has always been pretty savvy about, actually, in that, if anything, the last few years have taught us anything, it's that energy is the key determinant of inflation. And if oil prices are rising, as Trump knows, inflation will come up. And yeah, so I think those are the reasons why I think if I was Trump, I wouldn't be feeling great. I think a really telling moment came in an interview he did a couple of hours ago, even, where he accepted that there would be pain, which is not a very Trump thing to admit. Trump is he's always a sort of cake and eat it sort of guy. You're going to have everything and there's going to be no downside. And admitting there's pain, I think, is saying quite a lot from Trump. The last thing is that polling done just after inauguration suggests that while Trump is slightly more popular than he was in his first term, he's still unpopular by presidential standards. And none of these policies are popular. He came to office pledging to bring down the price of eggs and get the American economy booming or whatever, and reindustrialize America. And American the electorate did not vote for tariff-induced inflation and annexing Canada. It's just not what they voted for. Nor, by the way, last thing is that the cuts to US aid are part of this wider push from the Department of Government Efficiency, which is really taking its mandate seriously. And I think that was always an open question. But again, while you think that might be fiscally sensible, it is not what the electorate voted for.
No.
He did not come to power promising to slash federal expenditure. And I don't think voters will take well to that.
You got Elon Musk, like, sort of hostile takeovers of various departments, getting access to their systems and going line by line, and
the Treasury most recently, which is insane. The fact that Musk has been given access to the direct physical access to the Treasury,
and
just crazy.
Not in any way elected, obviously.
No,
and
he's
also
not even like a
approved
Senate appointed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think there was a really, someone pointed this out on Twitter, which is how I get most of my thoughts. Yeah. But there's a really good analogy with the wolf warrior diplomacy that the Chinese pursued over the sort of pandemic, which is when they basically sort of some very sort of angry bellicose diplomacy. And I think what the Chinese quickly learned is that actually that backfired, and whatever hard power gains or direct concessions they may have forced were offset by the massive soft power and reputational losses. And I think Trump will realize that, but probably towards the end of his term, assuming it takes him a couple of years in the same way it took the Chinese a couple of years.
Yeah.
And the last thing is that this all speaks to the fact that I think he is being led by the more extreme elements of his coalition. And I think there was a sense, actually, there's a real optimism in certain sort of like corners of American political class that actually, if his more moderate figures could get a handle on things, it would be both a sort of like quiet, still a radical presidency, but not necessarily a turbulent and like crap one.
Sure.
And I think the best example of this one, I really do think Scott Bessent was sort of the voice of moderation in Trump's like econ team, and some of his ideas are sort of macroeconomically sensible. He was talking about a sort of 2.5% universal tariff, focusing on sort of like America's overall trade deficit rather than these bilateral ones, which any macroeconomist, even those who are sympathetic to tariffs, will tell you is insane. And the fact that he's gone quiet, his tariff plan has not been implemented, and Musk now has control over the treasury systems, all suggest that those sort of more moderate, slightly more traditional Republican vibe dudes are out of the equation. Yeah. And I think that I don't think that's good for, mine personally, speaks to my slightly more small C conservative politics. I don't think that's good for America. But also, I just don't think it's good for Trump electorally. I think people really, really forget this, and that like he just did not campaign on that radical an agenda. He made pains to distance himself from stuff like is it Project 2025? And he was very radical about his immigration agenda, but his economic agenda, he just promised inflation will come down, you'll get great jobs. And he made sure to say like, look, I'm not going to cut Obamacare and that sort of thing. And that's just not, he doesn't have a mandate in that sense for the sort of program of massive federal upheaval that he's currently pursuing. And even leaving aside questions of democratic legitimacy, I just think it's going to be really unpopular if it carries down the current trajectory. Trump is not that popular in the first place. And obviously annexing Canada isn't popular. Obviously starting trade wars, if they do have inflationary consequences, aren't really that popular. It's worth remembering the trade wars in the first term were really, really minimal compared to what we're currently seeing. And I think people have mislearned a lesson that actually tariffs are fine. That these are not the same things. And I just think that will all go down really, really badly with American electorate, especially if there are really steep cuts to federal funding. He won that election on the back of a working class majority, essentially. And if the federal government.
It'll be interesting because some of the things like USAID, obviously at the moment, is contentious. Like there will definitely people who are upset about that, obviously, and Rory alluded to this earlier, the influence that could have over the world, not only soft power, but also like real people's lives who rely on that aid. You can imagine there being pushback, even potentially from more moderate Republicans when it comes from the soft power perspective. But you're right, when it comes to other parts of federal spending, when it comes to Medicare, when it comes to welfare, all these things which might not be intuitively popular in conservative circles, but you're right, his voter base is lower income generally.
And he just didn't say that.
No,
right?
He never said that would happen. So you can see that those people, when kind of
we talked about this a couple of episodes about like you can do a Millet, Javier Millet, which is clearly what Musk is slightly inspired by. If you run on a Millet-esque platform, if you say to voters ahead of the election, look, it's going to be pain for a year or whatever.
If you're as miserable as Keir Starmer, you can get away with it.
Exactly.
I don't think he's getting away with it.
Well, that's true. Maybe not. Okay. Interesting. We will see. And I mean, Trump continues to dictate the board, if nothing else, but he is moving down slightly from the top spot. Also, interestingly, a name mentioned there, Elon Musk, someone else who did make the top 25. But where did he land? Who knows? Find out in the magazine. Let's close today by doing our biggest winners and biggest losers of the week. As always, we'll run down the panel and each of you will say who your winner or ultimate loser is this week. If we have consensus, that person moves again, either up or down. If we don't have consensus, nothing happens really. It's a bit underwhelming. Rory, your options for biggest winner of the week are Netanyahu, Starmer, or Xi Jinping. Who are you going for?
Oh, what
a lineup!
I think out of those, I'm going to go for Xi Jinping.
Okay.
In terms of scale, I think he's had the best week.
Zach?
I think Xi Jinping, honestly, this is probably the best week any world leader will have this year. I think Xi Jinping is having the time of his life right now.
Did you see the photo of him from the Politburo, whatever it is? He's sort of just standing in the middle of the room with this little wry smile on his face.
I hate to cite tweets, but I saw a good one of someone saying like Xi to his cabinet, and it was that Trump thing, like going, we're never going to stop winning. You're going to say, Mr. President, it's too much. And he must genuinely feel like that. It's just victory after victory, and everything Trump lets slip is just another victory for the CCP.
Well, Zach won me over with his tweet reference.
Yeah,
so Xi
totally
Jinping.
fair. The memes win.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping moves up again, probably hitting the top of the board there. So interesting. We've maybe had a swap at the top. I don't know that for sure. The graphics will tell us. Ultimate loser of the week. Your options are Kemi Badenoch, Giorgia Meloni, Volodymyr Zelensky, or Donald Trump. Rory, who is your ultimate loser this week?
I think it's got to be Donald Trump for me. I think just the fact that we've spent most of this episode sort of having a go at it.
Yeah.
It feels natural.
I can't wait for Poland to come out because there hasn't been enough polling in the last couple of days because you've got to wait for the fieldwork to happen. But in the next couple of weeks, I think everyone should keep a really close eye on the polling. I would agree, Donald Trump. The one caveat I would make, by the way, is that there has actually been polling done on Democrats. And Democrats, I mean, they're not saying anything up for starters, but they are appallingly unpopular right now. The Democratic Party is the least popular it's basically ever been. Which, lucky Americans, they've got two crap choices at the moment.
Ben?
I'm actually going to go Badenoch here, just because I think we're starting from such a low baseline and has managed to sink even further.
That's fair.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. I would have assumed that things had got as bad as they'll get for her, but
To be fair,
she surprised me.
Being surpassed by a third party in British politics as one of the two big ones
consistently by multiple pollsters
is pretty rough. So I can see that.
Ed
in which
Davies
case,
going to get her.
Sorry,
Ed Davies going to get her.
he's going to get
It's
it.
inevitable.
So we don't have an ultimate loser this week, which means the board stays as it is, and this is how the board looks at the end of today's episode. Make sure to comment your suggestions of who you want to see moved or added to the board next week, and other than that, we will see you then for more World Leader Leaderboard. Goodbye.
Bye.